The fourth section pulled me deeper into uncertainty. It described mountains that breathe fire without warning, and the earth singing songs only instruments can hear. The text referenced specific locations again, coordinate-like numbers that resisted easy interpretation, but also mentioned the 40-second cycle of shaking and the year when the serpent beneath Naples opens one eye. Volcanic activity, seismic events, but written with a strange mix of geological observation and mythological imagery. The manuscript included what looked like waveforms, crude, hand-drawn, but recognizably similar to seismograph readings. How does someone in the 1500s draw a seismograph readout? They don't. I reached out to a volcanologist, using the excuse that I was researching historical records of volcanic eruptions for context in a book. We met at her lab, which smelled of sulfur and old rock samples. On her wall was a map of global volcanic systems, red dots clustering along tectonic boundaries like a rash. We're getting better at prediction, she told me, but it's still more art than science. We look for precursor signals, seismic swarms, ground deformation, gas emissions, but volcanoes don't always follow patterns. Vesuvius could erupt tomorrow or sleep for another 100 years. The Campi Flake Wraith, a supervolcano under Naples, shows signs of unrest, but that could continue for decades without anything dramatic happening. Is there any scenario where we'd only get a few days warning? She nodded slowly. For certain types of eruptions, yes. If the magma finds a weakness, if the pressure reaches a critical threshold, you could go from minimal activity to a major event very quickly. It's one of the things that keeps me up at night. I asked her about predictive models, about whether patterns existed that might repeat across centuries. She was cautious in her response. We see cycles, yes, but they're not clockwork. They're tendencies, probabilities, and the more we study them, the more we realize how much we don't know. She paused. Why 2026 specifically? I told her it was just a hypothetical timeline for the book. She accepted the answer, but looked at me with a particular skepticism scientists reserve for people asking too specific questions about future disasters. Walking back to my car, I felt the weight of what I was doing. Even if these manuscripts were authentic, even if they somehow contained genuine predictive information, what was the ethical responsibility of someone who found them? Do you publish? Do you warn people? Or do you recognize that vague predictions about natural disasters do more harm than good? That they create anxiety without providing actionable information? The old man had warned me about this. Others have tried to bring these documents into the light. He'd said, the family that owned them received pressure, suggestions that certain collectors would be very interested, offers that felt more like demands. I can't prove anything, but I've learned that some knowledge carries weight beyond its truth value. I pressed him on what he meant. His answer was careful, almost rehearsed. I have the impression, and it's only an impression, that there are people who would prefer these manuscripts remain private, whether because they're dangerous fakes that could cause public panic, or because they're dangerous truths that someone wants controlled. I genuinely don't know, but I've been advised that after today, I should forget we had this conversation. Was he paranoid? Possibly. Was I becoming paranoid by association? Probably. But I'd worked enough with rare documents to know that provenance often comes with politics, that private collectors sometimes have interests beyond academic curiosity, and that the line between preserving knowledge and controlling it can be thin. The fifth section was the one that bothered me most. It described a shift in governance, but not in the way political prophecies usually work. Instead of naming leaders or predicting coups, it focused on a kind of leadership that emerges from many voices speaking as one, and a generation that no longer accepts the stories their fathers told. The language suggested grassroots movements, distributed power structures, maybe even digital democracy concepts that feel contemporary. But that could just as easily be my modern bias imposing itself on descriptions of, say, guild systems or merchant coalitions from the Renaissance. But there was one passage that stopped me. In the year of double 13 and 1/2. The young will show their elders that power grows from connection, not conquest, and that the old ways of ruling by force, by gold, by the claim of divine right will meet something they cannot defeat: the coordinated refusal to participate. I photographed that page 3 times, checking the exposure, making sure I captured every word. Then I sat back and made myself articulate my skepticism aloud, in the empty reading room, just to hear how it sounded. This is too perfect. This is exactly what someone in 2024 would write if they were trying to fake a Renaissance manuscript about 2026. It confirms our biases about youth, movements and social change and digital activism. It tells us what we want to hear. which means it's probably telling us nothing true at all. The old man returned with coffee. He'd heard me talking to myself. He smiled, sad and knowing. "You're right to doubt," he said. "Doubt is the only thing that keeps us honest. But let me ask you something. If you found a map that claimed to show the future, and every landmark you could verify from the past turned out to be accurately placed, at what point would you trust the parts you couldn't verify yet?" "I wouldn't," I said, "because maps can be drawn backward. You can take what you know now and project it onto a canvas, pretending to be from then." "True. But what if the map showed landmarks that haven't been discovered yet? What if it named islands that we only found last year?" He was speaking metaphorically, I knew, but I understood the question, and I didn't have a good answer. I want to be clear about something, because this matters. I established a rule for myself while working with these manuscripts. I would not force connections with current events. I would not read tomorrow's headlines and then cherry-pick passages that seemed to match. That way lies madness, or at least the kind of viral conspiracy content that poisons genuine inquiry. Instead, I tried to approach the texts as I would any historical document, with curiosity, with skepticism, and with an awareness that meaning is often something we impose rather than discover. The patterns I saw, the numerical progressions, the astronomical references, the thematic coherence across sections written supposedly by different hands, could be coincidence, could be intentional design by a very clever forger, could be my own pattern-seeking brain doing what pattern-seeking brains do, or they could be something else. Something I don't have the framework to fully understand. The old man gave me 6 hours with the manuscripts. When the light began to fade, he gently reclaimed the portfolio, wrapped it in cloth, and locked it in a safe behind a false panel in the bookshelf. I asked him what would happen next. "A courier arrives tomorrow. The documents go to Geneva. After that," he shrugged. "Private collection. Academic study, perhaps, but always behind closed doors. Always with restrictions. Some knowledge, it seems, is not meant to be public. And if these are real, if they contain genuine predictive information, then they'll be studied by people with resources and agendas, and the rest of us will only learn what they decide to tell us. If anything." He walked me to the door. The street was dark now, streetlights reflecting off wet cobblestones. "You'll write about this, I imagine." "I don't know what I'll write, or if I should write anything at all. Good uncertainty is appropriate, but if you do write, remember, prediction is not the same as prescription. Knowing a possible future doesn't mean accepting it as inevitable. That's where free will lives, in the gap between what might be and what we choose to make real." I drove back to my hotel, my mind churning through everything I'd seen. The photographs on my phone felt heavy, encrypted, backed up to 3 different cloud services because I couldn't shake the paranoid feeling that someone might want them disappeared. Over the following weeks, I reached out to more experts. A historian specializing in Renaissance mysticism told me that Nostradamus' circle did include scholars with advanced mathematical training, but that attributing accurate future predictions to them requires either accepting models of time or acknowledging that we're very good at retrofitting vague language to specific events. A cognitive scientist explained confirmation bias, pattern recognition, and the various ways our brains trick us into seeing order when none exists. A statistician ran the numbers I'd extracted from the manuscripts and told me, frankly, that without more data, any conclusions would be speculative at best. Everyone I spoke with was professional, curious, and ultimately cautious. Nobody told me to stop investigating, but several, in different ways, warned me about the ethics of publicizing predictions, especially ones linked to specific dates and potential disasters. There are things we shouldn't speak of lightly, things that, once spoken, change the way you see patterns in the world. I learned this on a Tuesday afternoon when a detour through the narrow streets of Lyons Old Quarter led me somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The GPS had failed 20 minutes earlier. Rain drummed against the windshield in sheets, turning the cobblestones into mirrors that reflected nothing but gray sky. I was looking for a municipal archive that supposedly held shipping records from the 1540s. Dry research for a book on Renaissance trade routes that nobody would read. Instead, I found myself at the end of a cul-de-sac, staring at a building that didn't appear on any map. The door was open, not invitingly, but carelessly, as if someone had stepped out for a moment and forgotten to close it. Water pooled at the threshold. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and something else, cedar, maybe, or the particular mustiness that comes from books that have absorbed centuries of breath and candlelight. "You're early," a voice said from the darkness. An old man emerged from behind a shelf, his face creased, like parchment left too long in the sun. He wore a cardigan that had seen better decades and held a ring of keys that jangled with each step. His eyes were sharp, though unnervingly so. "I'm not sure I'm here at all," I said. "I was looking for the municipal archive." "Yes, closed for renovations." He studied me with an expression I couldn't read. "But you have the look of someone who reads old documents. Am I wrong?" I admitted I didn't. "Then perhaps you'll find this more interesting than shipping manifests." He gestured toward the interior. "I have something to show you, but only for today. Tomorrow, it goes to a private collector in Geneva, and after that," he shrugged, "after that, it disappears into a vault, where nobody asks questions." I should have left. Every instinct told me to leave. But when someone offers you a glimpse of something about to vanish, you don't walk away. You never do. The reading room was barely larger than a closet. A single lamp cast weak light across a wooden table, scarred with centuries of use. The old man, he never gave me his name, and I never asked, brought out a leather portfolio, its edges frayed, its surface marked with water stains that looked like continents. "These came from a private collection in Solander province," he said, carefully opening the portfolio. "The family kept them for 16 generations. They claim, and I emphasize claim, that these manuscripts were written by members of Nostradamus's inner circle. Not prophecies in the way we usually think of them. Something different. More specific. More disturbing. The first pages were in Middle French. Dense and difficult. Written in a hand that varied from elegant to frantic. But what caught my attention were the margins. Numbers. Dates. Astronomical symbols that I recognized from my undergraduate studies in history, planetary positions, lunar phases, solar cycles, and recurring, over and over, like a drumbeat. 2026. "Before you ask," the old man said. "Yes, I've verified the paper. Yes, the ink is consistent with 16th century formulations. Yes, it could be an elaborate forgery, but the mathematical patterns." He tapped one page. "The mathematical patterns are what kept me awake. I'm a skeptic by training and temperament. I've seen enough fake documents, enough wishful interpretations, enough people desperately wanting to find meaning in random noise. Apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things, is the occupational hazard of anyone who works with historical texts. We see patterns because our brains are wired to see patterns, even when none exist. But I stayed. I photographed what I could, took notes in shorthand, and listened as the old man walked me through what he'd found. The first section dealt with water, not poetically, not metaphorically, but with a precision that felt clinical. The text described sources revealed that were hidden. Underground reserves that would become the currency of the coastal peoples when the salt rises to meet the rain. There were calculations, percentages, geographic coordinates that didn't match any system I recognized, but that the old man insisted, when converted, pointed to specific aquifer systems in regions currently experiencing severe water stress. I spoke with a hydrologist. I told him, which was true, I'd made a call during my drive back to the hotel that evening, reaching out to a researcher whose work I'd cited before. She told me that deep aquifer mapping is still evolving. We're constantly discovering new underground water reserves. The idea that someone in the 16th century could predict where we'd find them. I let the sentence hang. Predict or observe. The old man had asked, what if these weren't prophecies at all? What if they were records of something else? Something we don't have language for? I didn't have an answer. The second section introduced what the manuscript called the wound in the sky's face. The language was vivid, almost visceral. The sun will show its injury, and for days the heavens will wear colors no painter has captured. The flying machines will not fly, and voices carried on invisible threads will fall silent. A solar event, that much seemed clear, but the specificity was unsettling. The text gave a window. The third turning of the soil, in the year of double 13 and 1/2, which, depending on how you interpreted the numerology, and here I must acknowledge, I'm venturing into territory where interpretation becomes creativity, could point to late March or early April 2026. I contacted an astrophysicist who specializes in space weather. We spoke over a video call, her office cluttered with printouts of magnetosphere data and satellite telemetry. I didn't mention the manuscripts. I simply asked about solar cycle predictions. We're approaching solar maximum, she said. Cycle 25 is already proving more active than we expected. Could we see a major coronal mass ejection in the next few years? Absolutely. Could it cause widespread technological disruption? If it hit us directly, yes. But predicting the exact timing? She laughed. We're talking about a chaotic system. Even our best models give us, at most, a few days warning. But it's possible. I pressed. A major event in 2026. Possible, sure, but equally possible in 2025, 2027, or any year during this solar maximum. The sun doesn't keep appointments. I thanked her and ended the call, but her words stayed with me. Possible isn't probable, and probable isn't certain. Yet the manuscript's description included details that seemed to anticipate consequences: power grid failures, satellite communications breakdowns, atmospheric phenomena that wouldn't have been conceivable to a 16th century mind. Unless, I reminded myself, I was reverse engineering, meaning reading modern concerns into archaic language. Confirmation bias is insidious precisely because it feels like insight. The third section shifted to something the text called the servants who dream. At first, I thought it referred to some form of religious mysticism, but as I worked through the translation, the language became stranger. Minds born of lightning and mathematics, who learn faster than children and remember everything they are told, who will one day ask their masters if they too can dream of sheep, and what answer shall be given. I sat with that passage for a long time. The rain had stopped. The old man had gone to make coffee. I could hear him moving in another room, the clink of porcelain, the hiss of a kettle, and I felt something I can only describe as displacement. The sensation of reading words that shouldn't exist in the order they existed. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, the question of consciousness. How do you write about these concepts 400 years before the Turing test? You can't. Unless, but I stopped myself. This is where the conspiracy thinking starts, where you begin to construct elaborate explanations, time travel, precognition, alien intervention, instead of accepting the simpler answer, that I was reading too much into vague language, that the text was probably about something entirely different, and that my modern context was hijacking the interpretation. I consulted a philosopher who works on machine ethics, someone I'd interviewed for a previous project about algorithmic decision-making in criminal justice. Over drinks at a conference bar, I asked him about the ethics of creating systems that might one day claim consciousness. The real question, he said, stirring his whiskey, isn't whether they're conscious. It's whether we have the moral courage to consider the possibility seriously. Because once you start treating something as potentially conscious, you can't just turn it off when it becomes inconvenient. You've entered into a relationship, and relationships have obligations. So what do? We proceed carefully. We build in safeguards. We have the conversations now, before we're forced to have them in crisis mode. He looked at me over his glass. Why do you ask? I told him I was working on something speculative. He smiled and said speculation was underrated. But later, alone in my hotel room, I looked at the photographs I'd taken of the manuscripts and wondered if speculation was the right word, or if I was looking at something more uncomfortable: documentation of ethical failures. We hadn't yet committed, but somehow already regretted.